Now, this is a tip when it comes to animating in Cinema 4D. Someone will ask, if I want to do a 3-second animation in Cinema 4D, how do I know where to put my keyframes on my timeline? Or how do I know that my timeline is actually 3 seconds or 2 seconds or 5 seconds? It's simple. The duration of your timeline will be based on your frames per second set in your project. Now, what is frames per second? Well, frames per second is how many frames will pass at each second, okay? And if you want to set this inside your project, you go to Edit and you go to Project Settings. And when you come to the Attributes Manager, with a time we have something we call FPS, that's the frames per second. By default, Cinema 4D is set to 30 frames per second. So on your timeline, every 30 frames is 1 second, okay? So 2 seconds will be 60 frames, okay? And 3 seconds will be 90 frames, okay? So that is how you will know how your frames are set or your duration on your timeline. And you can change this FPS to, let's say, 25, which is the most commonly used FPS. 24 frames per second or 25 frames per second, okay? But you can use 24 frames per second. That is the recommended one. That is what I used, okay? Unless maybe I'm doing something that I need slow motion, I'll slow it down in post-production. Then I'll set it to 60 frames per second so that in post-production I can actually slow it down to get that slow motion, okay? So let's set it to 24. Okay, and when you have 24 frames per second, automatically you see the timeline has changed from 90 frames to 72 frames. This means that every second 24 frames passes, okay, and the next second 48 frames passes. So when you look at your timeline, you see that there's this marked lines right here, okay, and then you see on the second it's actually longer. So that's how you can tell the 1 second and 2 seconds and 3 seconds. That's how you can tell the seconds in a project. So your timeline, the duration of your animation simply depends on your FPS that you set in your time. And remember, when you set your FPS here, remember to set that same FPS in your render settings so that it will match. So when you go to the render settings here, you see we have the frame rate still at 30 because it's using the 30. So you have to remember to set it to 24 frames per second before you render your animations, okay? So thank you. That's a tip for animations.